So yeah, intro and the headline. Stephanie, you want to say hello and Olivia?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Stephanie Luce, and thank you all so much. I'm so deeply honored for your attention to this and your presence today. So thank you.
And hi all, I'm Olivia. I've been helping, you've been the one receiving multiple calendar invites and emails from me. I've been helping very gratefully Stephanie and Deepak do the research and editing of this book. So I won't give my very biased top line opinion of the book, but thank you all for being here.
Wish it would go away, maybe?
Yeah.
Dorian?
Dorian Warren, co-president of Community Change, and headline of the book, maybe I'll just say two. First, I loved it, and I have a lot more to say. It's so dense in the best ways. And I'd say the other headline would be, this won't surprise any of you who know me trained as a political scientist, a little bit more on the underlying theory of democracy.
Okay, definitely like to come back to that. Lydia. Oh, and did you introduce where you were from and stuff, Dorian?
I'm originally from Chicago, always. So appreciated the Chicago references, and I live in Washington, D.C. right now.
Hi, everyone. Lydia Avila. I'm the field director at California Calls and also field director with Karen Bass for Mayor campaign. My headline, because Deepak just wants to know how can he make it better, but I'm going to talk about what I liked also. The headline would be, it's a book grounded in really teaching the best practices and fundamentals that were handed to us and used by our OGs, and like gets us all kind of like recommitted to those fundamentals. In terms of area of growth, I would say that there's been a shift within the electoral strategy to really answer the question from how do we use the scale and go deep and like build bases and actually integrate with the work that people are doing. And I know that might just be like Kelly calls, it's really just been grinding on this for 3 years, but I think that's something that I was hoping would come across in the electoral section a little bit more.
Awesome, thank you. Danny.
Hi, everybody. Danny Hosang. I'm in Connecticut and New Haven. I now teach ethnic studies at Yale. Go back quite a while with Deepak in organizing work. So much, yeah, I look forward to like all the things that I found so well rendered and realized. And then one feeling I had is I went on vacation this summer at a hotel that had this buffet that was like sprawling and never ending. And it's like, you didn't want to commit to anything because there might be something else there. And then in the end, you would have this big plate and, it was like, didn't feel like there was that focus to it. And so sometimes I felt that way going through the book, like, this is great, that's great, that's great, that's great. And I was going through the buffet. And so I was thinking, I want to think together about the good parts of that, how wide ranging it is, and also, ways to navigate it so the through line is more legible.
That's great. Thank you for that. Anna.
Yeah, hi, I'm Anna Galland. I'm an independent organizer, spent many years in and around Move On, still a fierce devotee and champion of Rana Epting, many of you know. I loved it, thought it was so useful as a kind of comprehensive contribution to some of the core conceptual grounding, some specific strategy models people could understand and self-understand through, and then offering some prescriptions for better collective and individual strategy development. I had 2 prompts that I've shared already with Deepak and Stephanie, which were, one, I'm just so curious what I think this is related to the buffet image from Danny, that is this book, is it primarily, or like how much is it of each of the following? An intervention, like an argument with some frenemies, and which frenemies? like trying to get organizers and campaigners to stop doing X and start doing Y. So more of an intervention or more of a contribution, trying to be the kind of comprehensive documentation of where we are, what we have, what we do, and what we can do. And if it's an intervention, I wanted perhaps like a little more salty, direct, you know, withering flagging of where those interventions were. I can't believe I just said I wanted more withering from these wonderful souls, but it would help me to better understand sort of what this is trying to correct. And then my second piece of feedback was to ask which portions of the manuscript could only have been written since Trump. That is to say, I felt that it did a great job of sort of delineating how we got into a hegemony of racial neoliberalism in that order. And it feels like an acute context many of us are wrestling with is, how do you do what we know how to do differently in a more or outright fascist context? And with all that said, I'm so honored to talk about it with all of you. I see so many good friends here.
Thank you for
But I'm
that.
based outside Chicago.
Great comments, and one of the co-authors is very capable of being withering, but has been holding back. Guess which one? Felicia?
I'm just like watching Lorella's little emojis. It's like, love it. Lorella, we see you. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Felicia Wong. I run the Roosevelt Institute. I am forever a Californian and somehow find myself in the lower Hudson Valley, but I'm happy and fortunate to be here as well. That's actually just generally true. I'm happy and fortunate to be here, especially in this conversation. I loved the idea that I loved the book, and I loved the idea that this was kind of a buffet, and I wanted to know like what the most important pieces were, or like what the main course was, because otherwise I was going to do nothing but eat tater tots and cheesecake, which is good, but like maybe some protein and then a green salad. So I actually ended up going through and trying to like pick out all the pieces that I thought were actually the headlines, or what my former editor Kendra Bozarth would call like the bloof, like bottom line up front. And I can list what I think some of those were in this, like right now or later. But yeah, well, I thought that I actually thought that one of them was that that you actually need a strategy that is multi-layered and takes a much more multi-layered understanding of power than we currently, like right now we talk about power building, but like I actually thought really that your ability to go through what power is and when to think of it, when to think about it is really important. So I thought that was one of the most important pieces. I thought your point that we actually need to better deal with conflict, that felt like a big like yellow, like conflict is inherent. So like don't weaponize it, use it towards better ends. I thought that was really, really important. This sounds like an obvious thing, but like both the idea that we need a 30-year strategy, which is like a lot of what the last part of the book is about. And it like force yourself to really go there. I thought that was really important. And I thought as a corollary to that, don't actually imagine that the right, don't sort of deify what the right did. I think that's an enormous problem that we have. Like, it wasn't just the Powell memo and then they all got in line. That's a misreading of history. For what it's worth, I think that Rob Stein, who I worked with for many years, and who I did and do adore in so many ways, but like he taught us the wrong lessons from a bunch of that. And so I thought that you were trying to help us unlearn. I don't know how many movement organizers really paid attention to Rob Stein, but I think a lot of people in the movement looked to him as a strategist for a really long time. And I do think he was a brilliant strategist, but it wasn't the only way to tell the story. And it certainly, I actually think he was genuinely historically wrong about how the right kind of came to be. And so anyway, I think that I don't mean to speak ill of Rob, I adored Rob, but I actually think you were trying to help us unlearn that story. But like many of those things, like conflict is necessary, think long-term, don't reify or deify the right, like a bunch of those things, like I found myself highlighting them in the book and none of them rose to the top. And just, sorry, last thing I'll say here, and I feel like I'm not gonna have anything more to say about this, but like, I really felt like the first chapter, just, you need to think again about what your actual core message is. Cause like your formula piece, that didn't work for me, to be honest with you. It almost felt like I couldn't tell whether it was like tongue in cheek or something, because I actually think you have a better version of the story than that formula, or a better way to give advice to organizers and to all of us in the movement than that formula made it out to be. And I just couldn't tell why it was there. But I say all this because I actually think this is an extraordinarily necessary book and message. I just want that message clearer.
That's great. No, really love those points in the pushing. Lorella, are you able to weigh in? Okay, great.
I am. I want to pick up with how Felicia closed, because I can't wait for this to be published and for us to really utilize it. So okay, I'm trying to withhold sort of responding and engaging in conversation with some of the comments, and just give you some top lines before we get into the conversation. But maybe I can't help myself and say, like, I think it's right that it's comprehensive and it's kind of like the big salad bar menu. I don't know that I found that to be problematic. Like I found it to be really trying to wrestle with, there are different ways to think about power. There are different strategies. And what you're really trying to do is both catalog those. And I think it's page 57, if I'm not mistaken, or around there, where you lay out a bunch of stuff and then you go into conclusion and you actually have an opinion about each one of them, like some of the limitations. Like, we actually think that state-based mass sort of people movement organizations are really important. That I think that's when it really is best for me. Like your opinion really comes through. It's more than cataloging. And if you can do more of that throughout the book, maybe it helps to address some of the comments. I really appreciated that. I like the overall, one of the top messages, right, is like, we're not really doing this. We can do this because people are not born strategists, right? Which I thought that was really helpful to hear as someone in a role where I think we need to be doing more strategy. And I think you really deliver a message about it. It's a practice. It's like a muscle and a practice that you build over time. And I think there is a lot of hope for people who read this book it kind of depends on like who you're trying to talk to. But for a lot of people in, say, like community change staff, it can be intimidating. But actually, when you do lay out all of the ways in which people have fought for change, and you say, you don't have to be born this way, it actually takes a lot of time and a lot of trial and error and a lot of creativity to get there, that it's possible. So I thought that was interesting. I had a similar thought as Anna around structural constraints. And so in a world that has changed so much, at least in sort of modern history, and like, can there be a deeper conversation about how to really think about strategy with the kind of structural dem constraints that we have? And then I thought also it was lacking some in more the information channel and communications challenge that we have. It's not so much comms, it's more how people are absorbing and making meaning of the world. And I just, it's just different. Like, it's not enough to do pamphlets and have an ad and like do some cultural strategy work like around music. It really is just, we're in a totally different landscape. And how do we not like overcome that, but how do we confront that? And how do you bring those two like democracy constraints, like structural constraints, to building power, and also how people make meaning of the world around them today, feel like could be a little bit more developed. And then I thought a third piece was on electoral power. You really wrestle with this, I think, some, but you could do a little bit more of like, when the governing party isn't delivering and when people just don't believe, right? Like the problem that we have with Black and brown voters today is, it's not, even though we've seen and had all of this success on economic policy, it's not actually trickling down. Like, it's not connecting to government. It's not connecting to necessarily as an outcome of their vote and their civic engagement participation. So is there a little bit more to do there? And, you know, I'm very excited about this. I've been geeking out and saying that to Dorian in the last 2 weeks. And I look forward to this being, you know, something that more people can tap into. I think, I guess my last point is, there are a lot of case studies looking back. I almost wonder if there's a little bit more of a prescription for the way forward. Like, I know I kind of gathered you decided not to do that, sort of beyond like, here are the ways, here are some of the things that you could do. But is there, as you close, because I didn't feel this way in your closing chapters, like a little bit more of like both a critique and the opportunity to really, you know, you talk about another future being possible. And like, is there a little bit more of a directive to organizers and to leaders in this moment?
Okay, you all have laid out some not so easy challenges, and we're not done yet, which I appreciate. We asked for it. Bill, we asked in 2 capacities. He's a brilliant organizer and also his secret life. So I hope you'll introduce yourself with both of those.
Oh dear. I don't normally do that, Deepak. Hi, everybody. And wow, I am a little bit intimidated by the folks on this call because you guys are just awesome. I'll just start by saying I just am, and apologies, I was a few minutes late too. So if I need to be re-prompted here, please do that. But I just want to say as a top line, I am so excited about this book. What I thought about as I was going through it was bringing me back, and forgive me for this because this is going way back, but my first like IAF training, I think it was, where they reflected on the fact that there is very little literature about power. And at least at that point, I think there were like 2 books that you could get that actually talked about power. And so what I was reflecting on is I feel like this is going to be this landmark book in what is already a burgeoning effort to actually understand power and write about it and think about it and help people, you know, figure their way through understanding power. And so I'm just super excited about that aspect of this. And I think the way that you're doing it is super brilliant. And we can get more into that when we get further into the discussion. The second big top line is that having been involved in labor movement for a minute, I notice that I brace myself when I'm reading something about labor unions. And I'm usually like picking out my red pen and just being like, wow, these people really don't get it. So that's my default, is like, you know, they got this wrong, they got that wrong, they got this other thing wrong. And so I was ready to come at you. But of course I can't, because your writing about the labor movement is so well done. And it just reflects the rootedness that you bring to this. And I was just, so that really impressed me. There's a lot of other things that impressed me too that we can get into. I won't want to blab on, but can I offer just one thing that I actually really am going to come at you with? And I'll do a writing, I have a bunch of things halfway written for you that I will get over the finish line this weekend. I want you to do something else with the preface. And I know this is probably just really stupid and maybe atmospheric, but first of all, it's the first thing people read, so I think it kind of matters, and kind of, you know, some of it I want you to push into an afterword, and then I want you to rework parts of it if it's not too late to consider doing that. And part of the problem is your modesty. And so this whole notion that Deepak Bhargava was wandering into issues and campaigns, I'm sorry, no. And so if you need someone else to write this preface, maybe that's what should happen, because I don't, you know, anyway, you know, and frankly, same thing with you, Stephanie Luce, like, oh, you know, I was just out there teaching a few classes here and there. And, you know, it's like, no, excuse me, you have been powering social change movements. And yes, you had a day job too. But, you know, so anyway, I don't know what I'm going to work on some suggestions for a solution. That was the only place I noticed another one of my tripwires, which is passive voice, which I think our friend Janet Schenk taught us about when we were a couple of us were on a board with her. And I'll find the exact, you know, manifestation of it. But, you know, for the most part, like, this is perfect. So these are all just like super, super minor things, but I want you all to flex a little and own, like, you have been leaders and change makers, and, you know, you have something to offer here because you're, you know, and you can do the whole, like, oh, we're learning from other people and all that, which is true and genuine. So that's fine to put it that way. But I want you to help readers who don't know you and don't know the story to understand that you're actually connecting the dots from a whole bunch of crucial struggles and movements that you've been helping power. It comes out as you get into the book, obviously, like, nobody could write this book and just be like wandering around and, you know, just sort of teaching a few classes here and there. But anyway, why don't I just pause there? Those are some top lines.
Wow. Stephanie, can I turn this over to you to, I mean, I feel like we should dig in on some of this. That was amazing feedback already. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Oh, wow. This is so wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah. So I think following up on that last point, one of the things we did struggle with how much to put ourselves in, but that relates to Anna's point about, are we making an argument, or is it more just like, here's the facts, and more of a reader for students. So we thought that was a useful, that's a really useful distinction to try and make. And we were just curious if other of you have thoughts on that. More like, should we be more assertive about, this is an argument we're making, and here's who we're arguing with? Yeah, any other thoughts that people want to jump in on that?
I'll just to add up a thing that I found myself wondering that might be the same question, Stephanie, like, was your primary hat here your teacher hat, educating a movement about frameworks, history, models? Or was your primary hat somewhat secretly your organizer hat, where you're trying to organize our movement to do better? And that might sound like a subtle distinction, but it's what I mean by, like, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like it was, I was trying to figure, I was like, I think it's both. They're wearing both hats, and I kind of want them to wear more of their organizer hat and whip us all into shape a bit more. And they're toggling back and forth between those modes.
Well, we just talked about this morning a little bit, but if there's an argument, you know, the only person I think we pick on by name in the book is Alinsky, which feels like a little easy at this point. It's with all the people who are like, I have the one way, and why aren't you doing exactly my thing, which is rampant in our world, right? And so at one level, it is trying to be the fair-minded, like depending on context and situation and your power analysis, there are actually lots of ways that are legitimate and effective, but you can demand a high level of strategic rigor rather than just kind of whatever. So that's that, to the extent there's a case, like that's the agitation, but it does mean, because we weren't aware of it, it does also want to present and so with some fairness, like the different modes in schools in one place, as opposed to people having to wander through their organizing careers, stumbling across them, those teachers. So some of both.
Can I share that that's actually the way that I received it, right, Deepak? That it was about, and like I've had a lot of really amazing mentors from since I was 17 as an organizer. Now I'm 40. And I think that maybe some of you are familiar with Anthony Thigpen, who's been one of my mentors. And I think that your book to me was kind of like being able to write down the lessons that Anthony's taught us at our organization and in California's movement, which I think is also a part that's missing, right? There's no talk about like the craziness that we've done and built an alliance of 102 organizations. And just his focus has always been on like being better strategists, and there's multiple ways, and you have to evaluate and you have to experiment and innovation and like really never give up on the base building, right? Get to scale, also think about depth, etc. So I did receive it as like y'all were speaking to organizers as organizers with experience and connections to the organizing world. And then I also feel like it was saying like there isn't a right way, there isn't the one way to do it. What we're not doing good at right now is really like for those organizers that we didn't get a master's in this, right? Like those of us that didn't have these piles of books handed to us and like study sessions and all this stuff, but learned it by hearing it from people and them teaching it to us and doing it in our day-to-day, right? And of course, like as a practitioner and a trainer of many other people, right? I feel like, damn, like, of course, Anthony has read that. Of course, Dolores was there, right? Like these people that I know, but taught it to us rather than in a book. So for me, I had already even, I'm like, I'm going to throw the idea out there. We could be like testers, right? To have a study group of the book at our organization and see how the rest of the folks, newer folks receive it. Because I also tried to think like, if I hadn't taken Deepak and Stephanie's class, like what would be my reaction to this, right? And I think my reaction would have been like, okay, well, is this for people that like have like a freaking PhD or like what happened, right? Like these are things the OGs read, but for those of us that are like from the hood and like just came into this, right? Like, yes, we went to college, a lot of us, but to me, it seemed like this is an accessible tool, and it's really about becoming and stepping into that sophisticated leadership that we need in the movement across the United States, within our across the whole nation, within our states and in our local communities, right? And how that shows up at our organizations where we're thinking about the bigger we, and we're thinking about 30 years, right? Not like the petition that we have to get out, the emails, whatever people are working on. So I just wanted to share that in terms of like how it was different for me than other things that I've read or things that have been passed on to me.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Lydia. Yeah, I think a lot of it was very much motivated from us teaching this class. And so for me, I think I was in teacher mode for a lot of it, but then wrestling with my organizer herself and not being sure of the right where to walk that balance. So how to make the book useful. I guess. Oh, Dorian, yeah, I see. Oh, sorry, I did. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to speak to this briefly because I think one of the challenges of writing any book is when you're writing for multiple audiences. So as I was reading, I think it's the hardest thing, actually. It's easy when you just have one audience that you're writing for. So I was thinking, okay, first and foremost, this is for organizers and activists. Second, this is for teachers and instructors and faculty, right? I could imagine this on so many syllabi on organizing and social movements. Third audience is actually maybe it kind of splits the difference, partly for organizers, partly for academics. You're actually creating a research agenda, maybe unintentionally, with this book, because you're actually laying out some propositions, hypotheses to be tested, to that under what conditions part of the book that's throughout the book. Like, it's actually a research agenda that I think a whole bunch of scholars are going to pick up. Another audience is basically staff and leaders of our organizing infrastructure. And then slightly, maybe a layer out is like the progressive ecosystem. So I was thinking of this. So those are like just some, like several different kinds of audiences I was thinking of as I was reading. The other thing I was thinking of is like, this is kind of like a textbook in a way. And not like a sociology 101 or econ 101 or government 101. It's more like econ, social, government 400 level textbook. And I say that in two ways. One, it's the kind of text that people will keep coming back and back and back to. And so the study group element of this that Lydia mentioned, and I think Anna too, like this, it's so dense in a way that, because I was already thinking, I talked to Lorella about this, like, okay, so how will we design a 10 or 12-week experience for our internal staff? 10 or 12-week experience of digesting the book, right? And taking it chapter by chapter. Well, it's actually have to be more than 12 weeks for that. But because it's so dense and rich, like you'd have to take, and with the tools and exercises, which I meant to say I love, that's super, 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 super critical part of this book are all the tools and exercises that allow people to experience the book and the practice some of the strategies in the book. So anyway, the top line here, I think there's multiple audiences, which is just an inevitable challenge. And then maybe one thing to Bill's point earlier about the labor, I feel the same way when I read about the labor movement. And my constructive suggestion from maybe one of the exercises and tools, and I'm looking at you, Stephanie, because you'll remember this, I immediately thought of the Brothenbrenner and Jurovich strategic corporate research tool from like 20 years ago as a way to orient people to like, this is a different way to do campaign research. Strategic corporate research is a very different animal, but it's applicable maybe to some of the other of the 7 strategies. So that's one additional tool I thought you might want to consider, or something like that.
Thanks. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe just to quickly build on those two, what Lydia and Dorian just said. I was thinking about, so I both like taught an organizing class, and then I like support students in summer organizing internships. And I was thinking how the book, it makes sense that it would come out of your lectures in class, because I actually, Dorian, I don't know that I could just hand the book over, especially to more like entry-level folks, because there's a lot of, on the one hand, I find the language is very accessible. Like there's such a great job of distilling concepts and just the way it's formatted. So I appreciate that. Like sometimes I've used some like Jane McAlevey. It's like these deep dives and I'm doing all this unpacking for them that makes it hard to just leave it with them. On the other hand, I also felt like because it has this rhythm where it'll mention an organization in Detroit and they did this, and then 2 paragraphs later, we're down in the Southwest and they did that. And it's really amazing, like that you can kind of just, you know, draw from this. But for people like who are not initiated and like don't read the Forge regularly, those references won't be as familiar. And so I could see how this works in conjunction with, you know, a lecture, like someone facilitating it, and then you can be directed, right? This is what it means. And I could also see like folks just like, oh, I want to know more about that on their own. The second is, you know, kind of what Lydia was saying about like, when, you know, we're in organizations and we learn strategy kind of by watching and listening again and again and again, and how like, that's hard to convey in a book, any book, right? So, and especially because you're not trying to do a how-to like that embodies a certain model. So I wondered about whether in the preface, there could be some direction given about, you know, like, how do you suggest people make use of this work? Does that make sense? Because it doesn't feel to me quite like it's something you can just turn over to someone and say, kind of dive into this and come back and we can talk about it, because there does need to be like some, you know what I mean? Kind of like accompanying as people get introduced to these different sites, because they'll have different forms of like background knowledge about that. So, but I could absolutely seeing it as like, here's chapter 3, and now we'll have a conversation about it kind of in this way.
Great. Deepak, should I pass to you or should?
Well, I'm trying to think where to go. So I feel like one place to go may be around the thesis question. Does that make sense? Like the kind of core argument which came up from a number of you. And does it come through? I'm curious if you all were to like feed back to us what you think the core argument of the book is. Like, do you feel like you could do that? Or to Danny's point about this buffet problem, does it feel like too sprawling?
Deepak, can you ask that again?
Yeah. Do you feel like the central thesis of this book really comes through? Do you know what it is? Having read it, like Felicia said, I don't like the formula. That's not a good expression of it, but it's somewhere else, et cetera, et cetera. Like the top line message, what is it?
And now we're in teacher mode. No.
Or are you asking all of
Totally.
us? Or were you
Yeah,
asking?
I'm asking like for anyone, like, no, you don't each have to respond, like, if it's not clear, well, I guess I
Yeah.
am, like.
Yeah, if
clear to
we're
you?
gonna move away from being a buffet, do you have suggestion on how to sharpen that? Like
Yeah, better.
we felt like we had a thesis, but it maybe does not come out.
Well,
so.
I think here's how I took it. I think the buffet is part of the thesis, actually. Like, okay, so there is a rich history. We have 7 strategies. For you/we are underdogs. We need strategy. There's a rich history of, forgive me if I'm oversimplifying, but there's a rich history of multiple kinds of strategies. They have worked differently at different times. Here's a bunch of examples. And the mistake that you can make is thinking that there is one way. Really what you need to be able to do is to assess the conditions around you, figure out what you're trying to do, know that there are multiple ways, and to try to understand how to incorporate both different ways of thinking about power and different like people in a set of alliances towards whatever your ends are. So that's a very long, sorry, that's not really, that was not great. But anyway, I thought what you were trying to say is the buffet is part of the point, right? You have to assess your surroundings and make a plan. But don't always imagine that it's always going to be the same everywhere, or even that you are always right. That's kind of what I thought you were trying to say. And here's all these examples of different kinds of wins. Yeah, the
I
jazz
think that's
ensemble.
pretty much it.
Anyway.
Yeah, that and what Anna put in the chat are very close to what we were trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anna.
Yeah, I all that, yep, is what I also took. And then I'm going back to Dorian's enumeration of the audiences, and there's like, and it was helpful for me to actually think teachers who will teach this are actually an audience. So there's like speaking through a layer of someone who will take the material and then teach it. But I also was thinking about, I was also thinking about whether this is aimed at people who are like squarely pragmatic radicals, or whether you're like trying to get the pragmatists to be more radical, or if you're trying to get the radicals to be more pragmatic. So I suspect it was it's like one notch further towards getting the radicals to be more pragmatic, but not far. Like mostly you're just talking to the core, the people who are down, trying to figure out how to win. But sorry, I guess I'm answering your question with a question, Deepak, by saying like, I'm curious what your thought is on the audience that is the key core heart of your heart audience.
I mean, I think Dorian and Lydia really laid it out well. I mean, practitioners is number one, first and foremost. I think the range of experience, to Danny's question, feels like how much experience do you have to have? Does it have to be in a study group? Do you need to be like inducted by somebody? Like, I don't think we're totally clear about that. We hope it's accessible. Our intent is for it to be accessible for the whole spectrum, but that may not be possible, right? Because I don't know. That's to me a question, but it's definitely practitioners, you know, and you know, I had in mind, like, what would I have wanted to read when I was 25? It was a little bit my audience, like, and so having gone through a variety of, you know, this is the right way to do it. No, that's the right way to do it. No, this is really the way to do it. Like, I would have liked to have known all of that at the beginning, so I could have put it together, you know, in a new way. So it's like to try to accelerate that process. That's really was for me a big motivation for it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I actually, on that, the other point I think is interesting, because I do feel like we were kind of talking to the radicals to be more pragmatic, but the pragmatics to be more radical. And it's a bit also, for me, the intersection of the academic and organizer world of like, yeah, we all have value in this and we all have a collective project. So it felt like that like intersection there.
And to Stephanie's point, I mean, a big thing is just like, we need a damn strategy, right? Like, we sort of take it for granted in this little room, but this is not our lingua franca, that we need to have evidence, we need to test things, we need to come back and discuss it, we need to let go of failures. The fact that you believe something doesn't make it true. Like, all that stuff was meant to be part of it. Like, yeah. Lorella?
So I just want to say, I don't think it's just for 25-year-olds, because I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that we're actually practicing what you're writing about right now. And so it might be that everyone is at a different level in, you know, their journey as strategists and movement builders. But I think it undersells what you're trying to do, to say, even though I do think it's really important for the young ones, for the 25-year-old organizers to have this in their hand, like, we just don't do this. We don't actually have rigor around any of the things that you've really laid out here. And I don't think we should walk around that and pretend that like we've really got it figured out. And so, and I do get your point across, like, there are different practices, there are different schools of thoughts, there are different theories. And I also don't get that I wouldn't say like one of my main takeaways is there isn't one right way. Like, it's kind of like, hey, remember that you have to have a theory of power. Remember that you have available to you different ways of looking at power and different strategies and that none of them actually really work on their own, right? Like, they're always conversing with each other to actually have some of the breakthroughs. And you try to do that, I mean, like in some of the charts that you include or throughout the book. So I almost think in your beginning that you could be, given the combined experience the two of you have and the state of our world, you can have a stronger critique and call to action to the people who read this book, right? Like, you can say like, we're not fucking doing any of this, like, you know, or we're doing that, like, and you say that later on in the book here and there, where you talk about leaders being exhausted and people moving from campaign to campaign or cycle to cycle and actually not valuing, you know, if you think about litigation, like litigators spent 2.5 years at the ACLU, it's their craft, and they spend so much time on the craft. They cannot actually litigate without really diving into the craft and getting better and doing the writing and and actually we don't think of it as a craft. And so how do you bring that up a little bit more? Like, you don't finish doing strategy or learning, improving as a strategist when you're 40 or 60 or 70 in this work, because the world around us is constantly changing and challenging us to re-examine our assumptions about power, our assumptions about how change happens. That's one. The other thing I wanted to invite you to do is to pick up Collective Genius by Linda Hill. who talks about how different it is to lead for change than to lead for innovation. Because your book is really leading for change, with sort of some parts really diving into innovation. But she makes the case they're actually quite different practices. And I wonder if you can incorporate some more of that when you do talk about the need to innovate, right? So she's like, you don't actually need vision. What you need is purpose. And she's, you know, when you're innovating, you don't quite know where you're going to end up. And you have to do it collaboratively. And so it might just be interesting for you to look at her work and see if any of it is of value to what you're trying to present.
That was great. Any more on thesis that folks want to put out there? That was very helpful and clarifying. I'm feeling myself get more withering as we go. Yes. And
Can I ask one follow-up? Oh, sorry, Lydia. Go for it.
I was just gonna say that I agree with Lorella, because that's how I interpreted. Like, this is a call to action for us to be better at so many things, right? Like, I have the privilege of working with hundreds of canvassers, like over 500 canvassers every year, at least 100 to 200 core organizers in the state. And we always talk about that, like, dang, like a lot of people, they don't get this at home, like the way that Cali Calls does, and the way that we've been taught to do the rigor, the discipline, the power analysis. Like, we still use the tool at every staff meeting, and people are blown away. And I'm like, what do y'all just use it at the beginning of the campaign? Like, that's not how we roll, right? Like, we're fighting for power, we're fighting for governing power, we're fighting for governance as well, right? An expanded view of what that looks like. And so it's like, we have to be serious about studying the best practices, innovating on them when we are able to, you know, like, master them, I guess you could say. And then like, we always feel like our role in the movement, those of us that work at California Calls, is to build that in other people. And so this would be like a tool that I was serious about. Like, I think people should do this, because people always think like, oh, we want to know how Anthony thinks, or we want to know how Carla, blah, blah, blah. All of you all think so. It's because we've been taught a lot of this practice, right? And there is a situation going on where, at least in California, it feels like there's a lot of intra-left drama, where like the further left folks saying like, we're not progressive enough, we're neoliberal, practically calling us neoliberals, right? But I think this takes it back to like, look, let's look at the fundamentals of what's needed to win, and let's chart paths that actually get us to victory and making advances and taking power away from our opposition and putting it back in the hands of our people. And let's get serious about being better organizers, better movement leaders, and like moving more people into the movement with those principles as well. So I think that definitely there could be more said to be like, y'all, this is something like that we all need to do so much better at, and like, we're not there yet, because obviously we've lost so much power.
that was great. Thank you. I think Anna or Felicia wanted to get in, maybe both, around the thesis piece before we leave that.
Just a brief thing, and I put it into the chat, was that I feel like I don't know how big this is relative to the full thesis, but it felt like an important piece to me, that you're bringing focus to strategy itself, not just per organization or per campaign or per initiative, but as something that is worthy of building out new and different formations. I think you have I forget what you call it, strategy hubs or something like that. And you reference Highlander, like, we know how to do this actually from different points in our own history. But then I also love that so it's like, one of the parts of the thesis is just value strategy. Another part is like, train up on it. And also we need to build some different things to support strategy learning that we don't currently have. And then it's okay to look at business or Silicon Valley or the military for examples to learn from. I also saw as a sharp argument with, back to intra-left drama, like some forces on the left who would say like, no, that is contaminated, you can't touch it. So Yeah, but the sectoral agitation struck me as like a little bit buried and important actually for people to hear.
Alicia?
Oh, no, I didn't have anything really
Okay.
to add.
So I'm wondering if we can move past thesis and talk about some of the stuff that came up that folks felt like wasn't there in the book or should be more of. So one of them, and we were highly conscious of this, Stephanie and I, was a kind of cluster of social media, tech, the way people are kind of living, getting information, et cetera. Like, what does it mean for the future? You know, we also have a question about our narrative strategy chapter, which we are maybe the least confident of whether we kind of got that one right. So in that whole zone, we really welcome ideas about what we should do to build that out. I think we agree that it needs more. Dorian?
I was going to go in a different direction,
Go for it.
and I mentioned this earlier, and say sort of there are some implicit assumptions throughout around what I'll call liberal democracy and sort of principles of democracy, or maybe I'll just say it more concretely, like the rules of the game and political institutions. And someone mentioned this earlier, I think, under the category of constraints. And you do, you have a thing in there about Overton window, but this, and maybe this is related to the electoral chapter, where like the rules of the game are kind of taken for granted for the most part. And I was thinking about, okay, so what would be the strategies under electoral, at least in that chapter, that's about changing the rules, right, in the institutions that shape and almost define what we think of as possible. Can we think of, and I'm not suggesting you go down this route, but I was thinking like, okay, proportional representation and multi-member districts, and there's like the rules, and yes, Felicia and I wrote a book all about rules, but the political scientist in me was wanting you to make that just a bit more explicit.
No.
Because as I said in the chat, I was thinking of this question like, well, under what conditions do each of these strategies work? And especially, I think maybe Anna, you said this, or someone, like in terms of authoritarian versus democratic regimes. But then I was thinking, well, the South was a racial authoritarian regime in actuality. So a lot of these strategies actually do work in multiple contexts. But how do you make that a bit more explicit, I think?
Well, let's talk about that for a little while. We've debated whether to do more on authoritarianism and fascism in the book, and how to deal with violence, both in the sense of like its role in social movements, which I think have complicated feelings about, but also how people deal with violence from the state, right? Which again is not new in American history, but we may be on a beginning of a new wave. So what should be the frame around, or what do we need new material? Yeah, just curious, like what needs to change?
Oh man, it's always easier to critique than be constructive.
Well, the under what conditions thing is constructive. I mean, I think we could build out like the inside-outside game and lobbying legislatures in a time where there's a fascist government. Like, doesn't make sense in Georgia right now, right? Like, that's not what you would spend your time, and that's not what activists are spending their time trying to do. So I think the under what disruption probably gains a much more strong, collective care probably gains a much more strong. Maybe we could do some of that.
This may be too narrow, Deepak, as an answer to that question, but one thing I was really sitting with was exactly to Dorian's point that we've had authoritarianism in this country, unevenly distributed, unevenly applied. And some of the strategies that the civil rights movement used in the context of a hostile state still work, still can work, still can be learned from. And some of them, I honestly think we gotta rethink. Like we're living in a post-shame political environment with respect to MAGA, and a bigger percentage of white conservatives were shameable for a chunk of the sort of key moments in the civil rights movement than I would argue seems to be the case now, or at least I want to see someone unpack that. So like one way of One interesting thing I would love to see someone do is, this gets to maybe the like, this is a whole research agenda, is just do a kind of study of what specifically are lessons learned about organizing under authoritarianism from the civil rights movement that applies now, and what do we need to recognize for reasons of the information environment we're operating in, for reasons of the hardening of the MAGA faction or otherwise. It's just not an apples to apples, go do that thing they showed us how to do. And then I also love the specific chart about how these strategies play out, strengths and weaknesses specifically around political and governing structures and constraints.
Any others on that point?
Yeah, just to jump in quickly, I mean, to me, this is it's the flip side of it's an interesting move, like where you can see a quick snapshot of something that happens in like 1865, and then, you know, jump to 1920 and there, because it suggests that there's like some continuities right across. But I think part of what we're also talking about is the need to, part of strategy is being attentive to context. And so being able to say something about that. And I actually, just to speak to that about like, and maybe this is in the preface, about saying something about the particular context, which I think is both about, you know, the kind of authoritarian moves people just mentioned, but it's also about just the withering and collapse of many liberal institutions. And not just from above, but people's like deep ambivalence about them. You know, do civil rights, you know, laws actually protect me and secure my well-being? Is like a public health system really going to worth my consent and engagement? And that's not just coming from MAGA, that's coming across, you know, like our respective bases, some of whom are identifying with MAGA. So, you know, for me, it's kind of like, you know, there's an earlier period when these institutions are more stable, when an Alinsky kind of like, hey, get everyone, vote, run for this, you know, you can reform. The mechanisms are there. You know, that's no longer the case, right? And that proposition, put some time into this project and you'll see the doubt outside of, you know, maybe a collective bargaining campaign or something like that. Does that make sense? There's some disentanglement between the collective energy and the notion that the prevailing systems can deliver. I'm not saying they can't, I'm just saying we're in a moment where the ambivalence about that is growing across the board. So that's partly what I was also thinking about, is to be able to name some of that context that, you know, beyond the authoritarian, there's just a withering of ambivalence about collective action, public protections, et cetera, that is helping to get this moment, you know, defining the conjuncture we're in.
That's super helpful, and it maybe adds another thing you could do with it, which is say, maybe it's not that some strategies disappear altogether, but do we want to say anything about what's the right, like, emphasis in a historical period, right? Like it, you know, there is outside work to do where there was the last couple of years. There was some, you know, was there too much attention on DC and Build Back Better and in this situation, and not enough on finding ways to disrupt, as a hypothesis, right? But that kind of thing, that's helpful. Yeah. More on authoritarian. Yes, Felicia.
Yeah. This is maybe at the other end of the barbell or whatever from the authoritarian comment, because I do think I've been thinking a lot about this question of whether it makes sense to bring more very contemporary context to this. Obviously, the MAGA movement is part of that. I do think the other part of that isn't in this book, not really, is some of the recent wins. And I believe the student debt win is enormous. I would have liked to see more canceled, but the idea of canceling any debt at all is, in fact, that's a reparative policy that was agreed to and sanctioned by, took a lot of fighting, but the President of the United States. As a backward-looking policy, which acknowledges a deep systemic injustice. That's how I see it. Anyway, so it feels like there are some recent wins, that you could frame as actual narrative wins. I actually believe that, a bunch of the EJ money in the Inflation Reduction Act, I know it's totally imperfect. It's much less than people wanted. Part of the intra-left fight right now is about that. But I think actually demonstrating the ways that these are a step forward, not just because there's billions of dollars on the table, although yes, but also because it actually reflects a new way to think about what federal power and federal policy is for. So I believe that there is, on the one hand, the terror of the current MAGA movement, and there are some green shoots. You could talk about it actually in some of the labor movement organizing too, but so like bringing some of that forward and actually interrogating those things in the context of the 7 strategies that you lay out. It could be interesting, maybe in an afterword or something like that, because you wouldn't want to kind of date the whole book. I think that's probably a danger, but things have been more heightened in the negative, but actually also in the positive recently. And so I think that linking that to some of the strategies more explicitly could be pretty useful. And I say that, by the way, as the only organizer in the room. I'm more like an ideas organizer, I think, maybe. So anyway, but I did think that part could be sharpened or strengthened.
So great feedback, Stephanie or Olivia. I want to make sure if you want to do a redirect. I put in some other topics I wanted to get to the next 55 minutes, but go ahead.
Well, I was also going to ask about, we did have a little bit of feedback about our terms overdog and underdog. So I wanted to see if you all want to talk about that a bit too. We really struggle with the right terms for that, but yeah, the music metaphor or racial neoliberalism is a frame. Yeah.
I don't have a take on the overdog underdog. What I did like about the book is in the multiple places throughout, you define terms. That's really, really important and very useful for readers who might be discovering conjunctural analysis for the first time, for instance. So I really appreciated your care in defining terms that can be jargony, right, to someone who's a novice in this.
Yeah, I thought the music metaphors were really useful. They were very helpful. And I thought I was glad that you named racial neoliberalism, never looked back, kept talking about it in that way, didn't to and fro about it. I thought it was I'm very biased on this, but I thought it was quite useful.
That's helpful. We got some feedback from others, not on this, but from the other calls, that like it was confusing. Like there's neoliberalism, there's racial capitalism, and then we're like coining this thing racial neoliberalism.
Yeah, well, I'm the wrong person to ask about that, Deepak, I'm afraid. I thought it was great, but you should ask not me.
Aha, see, we've got some quibbles. Do you want to say anything about it now, Dr. Warren?
I mean, just briefly, I put little comments in the margins of my copy, just to say, I think, for instance, the Nancy McLean book gets this part of the story right of grounding one aspect of racial neoliberalism and the mass resistance to integration in the 50s and 60s into creating exclusionary public goods, particularly. So this is the Heather McGhee story of draining the pool, for instance. So I kind of think it starts a little earlier. It's just a minor, I don't have a big quibble with the overall picture the story you paint, but just some minor, there's some offshoots that spring up around racial neoliberalism, the public choice theory stuff, like without going into detail, but I have it in the margins of my copy, at least. Okay. It's just minor stuff.
I stumbled on overdog and I wrote in the margin, do you mean top dog? And then I was like, hot dog, super dog. Like I was going on a little riff of different possibilities. But then I went back and deleted it because later it grew on me as I saw you working with it. It was just like it gets a kind of like over class. It has a class dimension in it in a way that just, I don't know. So I hit a friction point and then it was workable and fine for me. The dog.
Yeah, I don't feel like we were like completely committed to it, but we didn't have a better alternatives. So
I guess just what I felt the same way. Like there was something, it's, you know, it's just simple as a schema to do it. And then I also thought about our moment where you have like, you know, these alliances of like fairly wealthy Democrats, you know, aligning behind certain kinds of progressive policies, and working class voters, including some non-white working class voters, on the other side. And in this schema, they're on the kind of top dog side, not because they have like extant social power, but because essentially they're lining up with more, you know, kind of like right-wing anti-public, right, kind of remedies. So that's where it doesn't quite capture, I feel like, the dynamics you're describing, but anyway.
Well, there are lots of overdogs who think they're underdogs in our situation, right? It's a little bit of what's going on.
Oh, yes. No, the whole political vocabulary, you don't start with I'm an underdog. Yes.
Right.
You disavow all your power, right?
Yeah. What about this? We're in a brand new world where people are living in social media and culture and, you know, what do we say about that? What does that mean for the book?
I'm sorry, Deepa, can you say it again? I'm still on
It's
my dog thoughts. Yeah.
You're still on underdog, overdog. Yes, I know it's fascinating. I'm going to check out the most shortly. Was the tech question? Does there need to be more about digital tech, online spaces, organizing in online spaces, examples? Maybe that's the student debt piece that Felicia and a couple other folks. I don't. But does there need to be more? Did it feel like not of now because there isn't more of that up front?
Lorella keeps saying yes in the chat.
Tell me what you would do. Tell me what you would do, Lorella. Like what
Yeah.
does it need? A case study? Does it need a theory about like we're in some new, and I hope it's not that, because I don't know what it is. Like we're in a new age where people are constituting their identities in some wholly different way than what we're used to. Therefore, I don't like what is it? Where does it take you?
I mean, even if you just started with, you included some more on how people consume information and make meaning in today's world.
Yeah.
For people who are not all paying attention, like everyone's in their bubble, I think that even that alone, I think, makes a big difference. Then of course it's like, so therefore what, right? But there isn't, it's not just like Twitter. It's like people are no longer watching cable news, really. It's not where they're getting their news from. People and like young people of color especially over-index on YouTube. That's where they're getting their information. And you have all of these media personalities. You have all these personalities that the right is really developing. And so actually part of the strategy, and I think Ekis is probably leading on some of this thinking right now, has to be to develop personalities that can live on YouTube and can speak to a whole base of people we have no other way to reach.
Yeah.
So, you know, some discussion about that would be interesting. I think we live in like a post-truth, post-fact world for a lot of constituencies. And like, you know, how do we wrestle with that in the context of both organizing and like making meaning?
I think one other thing I would add is like in the context of the role that mass communication and digital organizing plays in being able to get to scale and changing worldview and advancing narrative, right? Like there were digital comms folks that I heard talking about, you know, there was all this outrage online about Roe versus Wade, but then you show up at the march and there was not a lot of people and not a lot of movement infrastructure for people of color to step into the Roe versus Wade fight in real life on the ground, right? So like we have to absorb them in our movement, even though that's not a core strategy, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's like how it ties in like broadcast communications as well as the digital organizing that we've seen happen, but like how it still needs to be tied into this bigger movement, right? Like you're not just gonna get people digitally if there's nothing to plug in locally.
Well, those feel like some actionable ideas that we could work on. Yeah, Anna?
I'm feeling very mindful that I'm like, okay, so you guys are going to need to spend 2 more years writing a whole new 7 chapters. So like, you know, filter this through what is feasible. But I feel like I kind of like the idea of a case study that is like the right case study of a really truly digital first campaign that engaged in membership development and reckoned with power, like in a true way. Because we know one thing I noticed in the book was that the word campaign was not very much used.
Yeah.
And I wondered if that was intentional, but to me, it felt like a corrective actually against a world that I know very well where campaigns are all you think in. Like this is from here to there, we're trying to change this target's mind. We're going to put all this public pressure generated overwhelmingly digitally and see if we can notch a win. And you're like, you're doing something very different. So I was feeling a little stumped on what the right answer is for the case study. And so it might be that this is a more speculative chapter. I do think it's a kind of leading edge that many different groups have been trying to crack for a while. Not just, remember how we used to say online and offline, but like nothing is offline. We are all online all the time effectively. And so I wonder about a speculative case study, which is about perhaps, I think to that point, Lydia, that I think you just shared, like about a person or a small company that's kind of acting like an organizing and base connected group. So I'm thinking of like the YouTubers who are mobilizing people to do stuff in the real world, whoever it was who got the K-pop kids to buy out an entire stadium of seats so that Trump would have an empty rally. Like, what are some of the, you know, there was a town square project at Reddit where you could only change 1 pixel every 5 minutes, and it ended up being this very contested kind of swarming collective action experiment. I'll think more offline and send you some notes on some possibilities, but is there a, how do we contest when the medium we're contesting in is the digital environment almost only, and is not starting from a place of deep relationship, is not starting from a place of geographic connection, is not starting from a place of all these other building blocks of organizing theory that we know. And what can we learn from this case study? Not this is the model, but like what are some speculative learnings that we can take from it?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there's certainly so many like exciting frontiers that we did not really touch on. And one to me would be also more international type of, campaigns or work. And so that might be a way to deal with it, is not through a case study, but like raising it, but not, yeah, thank you. That leads to the question I was going to ask, is if we did add another chapter on any of this, including violence or anything like that, are there other chapters or areas that you felt we could cut or cut back on, and being like totally honest and open with us. Are there places you were reading where you were just kind of bored, skimming over, like where we could tighten?
Be brutal.
Yeah, we can take it.
Totally could take it. It's really helpful if you.
Yeah, Felicia.
Two things quickly. I loved the inclusion of collective care. I thought that was a really important piece to put in the buffet, as it were. Very good and very important course that many of us don't think about enough. So I thought that was great. I did think the narrative chapter could be extended to the present
Huh.
a little bit more than it is.
Uh-huh. What would be some of the things you would include to extend it to the present? Like, what do you have?
I would actually take the Occupy through line literally all the way through to like student debt reform.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's great.
Todd.
I guess for me, because of the kind of because you're not actually advocating like some hierarchy, these are the best, these are less effective. It meant that if you encounter something that feels you're less connected to, you can just kind of move on. I felt when I was reading the military chapter, in part because of all the diagrams that were in that one, it was a little like disorienting. Like I felt like I really would have to attend to it, to figure out what the argument was. The other just quick one I want to say is I appreciated the chapter about like conflict and disagreement and approaches to working through those. I wondered also, though, if some of that could be incorporated in the respective chapters, because I felt like, to use another metaphor, like these were the on your social media, like the best, the most flattering versions of each of these approaches and modes. Right, the ones that are fully realized, where someone tells an anecdote, people were coming out of this, like everything unfolded exactly as we would hope, almost in a kind of like romantic way. And so not to then say, but that was not all as it seems, because we, but that I find, I have this thing when it's like students read about this and they go to work for organizing groups, and then they're like, this is a little different than what we were, all the like rewarding, amazing things that are happening. So I don't know if there's a way to convey a little more of just the real texture of how these kind of play out without coming off as like cynical or pessimistic. But, sometimes it read like that. These were just like very fully realized accounts of, in the best cases, kind of what happens that don't allow us to see some of the other kind of parts.
Uh-huh.
That's such a good point. We had hoped to really lift up moments of key strategy making in those cases, but it didn't. I don't think that really came through, and I don't think we brought that out enough. But it's along those same lines of highlighting the tensions, the difficult decisions.
Yeah, and just one, it's part because, again, the pace moves along. It doesn't like quite have time to say, here's some context. They first tried this, it didn't quite realize, then they tried this, then this is what helped to open something up. So yeah, but then that would come at the cost of like going deeper into fewer, examples probably.
I'll just say,
Yeah.
Quickly, I liked your framework of power. And let me say it this way, I liked your typology of power. I will say there were moments where I got a little stuck with all the different hat tipping to other people's typologies of power, the Archon Fung thing here, and Beverly Silver over here, and Richard Healy over. It was like, okay, are there like 20 fucking like dimensions of power at this point? And like, which one, I like yours, but and there's nothing to do here, I actually think. But I got tripped up, and I feel like I've spent 20 years studying all these different kinds of power. And it was like, whoa, this is a lot of list of different people's ways of categorizing power. So it's a good resource, but it's just, you need someone to walk you through that. I think, if you were coming to this for the first time. It's a bit overwhelming.
I actually I'm realizing I didn't put this in my own notes, but I remember being a little unsure what you, or thinking that you were being a little less direct than you could be in the chapter about internal organizational stuff. I was like, you know, a lot of shit that's happening. Like, which thing are you talking about here? Which dysfunction are we talking about right now? So that's just like, if you feel that you can, to be a little more direct about which piece of our organizational stew that so many leaders are in, are you speaking to?
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have a number of directions to go. Olivia, do you want to?
Yeah, I think thank you all so much for this. As we're sort of going through each of the case studies and noticing what was missing, within those, we wanted to be very purposeful about making sure that we were wholly representative of issue areas, demographics. We definitely leaned more towards past examples, so it was a little bit easier to analyze them in completion rather than things that are still ongoing. And I'm glad you all brought up, the need for more current ones. But were there any case examples that you felt like might be missing that we should have brought in? For example, we were thinking about bringing in more about the movement for Black lives into the conclusion, but like glaring where you're like, why didn't they talk about, this movement that happened whenever? Be curious to see whether you thought that we were pretty representative, or maybe we missed, a disability rights movement, something like that.
One of my favorite disability rights movement disruptive actions that I think is under recognized is the way in which the group adapt when they sat in Senate offices at the height of the fight to save the Affordable Care Act. Totally changed the public narrative and momentum of the fight. And I actually think we might not have gotten to where we got without that intervention. So that might be one to bring in.
Yeah.
I don't have any suggestions on case studies, only just I mean, I'm kind of repetitive, but sometimes it felt like to demonstrate the breadth, there were like, just again, these kind of quick references to them that didn't go. So I would I don't know, maybe think about when something is included, especially there's some that are very, very brief. Is it mostly just to kind of acknowledge it, or is it doing work for the argument in the chapter? Because, most of them felt like the second, but some felt more like the first, like it was a kind of nod to it. So, and again, at some point, it just felt like a little, dizzying.
Another follow-up question I had to go back to the thesis. Thank you for giving your thoughts on what you took away. It was one thing that I think we kept kind of coming back to is it clear and consistent throughout the book, right? Like we go through theories of power, we go through the 7 models, we go through, lessons from conservatives. Is that thesis that you took away that we discussed, 30 minutes ago, are you reminded of it as you're reading it, or do you somewhat get lost throughout? And whether, if you did feel like you got lost, ways in which, you felt like we diverged and how we could bring it back a little bit. And if you thought it was clear and consistent throughout, well, wonderful.
I thought it was actually pretty consistent. I just wanted a little more signposting.
Okay.
Which refers again to my like desire for maybe a slightly different first chapter or
Yep.
or just the other thing I've been thinking about it, just listening to all of this, if I were doing the next edit of this, because some of what people are bringing up here is like irreconcilable. Multiple audiences, two hats, you know, the organizer hat and the teacher hat or whatever. And maybe you just say that up front, like, you know, like, look, there are going to be multiple audiences. We are both academics / scholars / teachers and activists and organizers, and you're going to feel that tension throughout. But here's what we think is consistent, you know, thesis statement. And actually, that's how life is. That's it. Like, that's why it's okay. Because like we wear these hats in real life, and you probably do too. Student reading this, movement leader reading this, young organizer reading this, old, you know, think tank person reading this or whatever. So it feels like I don't think these things are soluble. And so therefore acknowledging the tensions and making them part of what the book is could help kind of settle it out.
To this point, did everybody agree? Several people expressed satisfaction with the preface and the intro. Did everybody agree that those like need a lot of work to be like, here's what we're saying, like, you know, just more bright lights, like signposting for the rest of the book and so forth? Is that kind of a general view? Yeah.
And I just, one small thing, I'm sure this is not possible, but you pivot back from the first to the third person. So when you tell, it's like an effect of writing collaboratively. I wondered, especially for the preface, when you're telling there are slightly more intimate stories, if there was a way you could have it be in the first person and then just have it say Stephanie, Colin, or Deepak, because it removes a little bit of the, like a texture of what it would be like to tell a story in your own terms when we know you're writing it, kind of talking about yourself. Does that make sense? But it's, when I saw in the preface, I thought, oh, like, couldn't it just be done this way so that they can just hear directly from you? But then as you were doing it across the other chapters to insert yourself, but well, maybe that's not possible, but I don't know if there's a way to play around with that format. Yeah, so just a small observation.
Yeah, we looked at different models of how other co-authors have done it, and you're right. Sometimes they just say the name and write, and there's something really nice about that too.
Olivia, did you want to ask about the conclusion?
Yeah, so we have our bullet points that you saw, which were somewhat summarizing various through lines that we had in the book. But we also, part of what we were talking before we were meeting today in preparation for this call was this idea of reiterating that this book, I think maybe Felicia said this, we don't want to timestamp it too much, and to that end saying like this is a living and breathing document. Like part of this is constantly reorienting and updating and doing that conjectural analysis. But whether you all had any additions to the bullet points we had, and if you didn't get there, that's okay. It was a lot of words, but ideas of how to wrap this all up. And maybe it is bringing us up to the present day and using, bringing the authoritarianism in a little bit more, the fascism, bringing movement for Black lives. We were a little hesitant, as I said, to explore current day, movements when we haven't had distance to like fully analyze them. But any thoughts on maybe having that be in the conclusion would be super helpful as we write it.
So one version of dealing with the authoritarianism piece would be to go real heavy into it. But I think let me say that more broadly, really heavily into the the most challenging dynamics of our present, let's say, which includes authoritarianism. But I think to Danny's point, also the kind of collaboration and complicity and hollowing out of some institutions that could be a bulwark or could be doing much more to advance the world we seek. So I just wonder about, like, the book is very hopeful. I realized that maybe one thing that was so pleasurable about reading it is that ultimately, like, there's all these examples of things that have worked and things we know and frameworks we have and things we can do. So maybe this is a super bummer of an idea and you should not do this. But one thing you could do is in the last chapter, be like, look, this is the world we're currently in, but yeah, let's look into the abyss. It's sort of to state the enormity of the challenge of the moments we are heading into, and to say, we're gonna need all of what we talked about because look what we're up against and look how things are developing. So these are not the only, like, if we were writing this book again in 10 years, we hope that there will be 3 more models that perhaps are iterating off of the example of what Movement for Black Lives has just started to crack the nut of, or, you know, so it's looking into the abyss as a challenge, not as a recap and not as an intervention, but as a kind of pulling people forward into the future.
I think related to the comments I have about the electoral section, which I can talk about whenever you all think is more appropriate. But I think the conclusion should kind of give a picture of, like, these are the breakthroughs we can make if we become better at all this other stuff that we just said we need to do better at. Like, this is the nice things we can have, right? And like, be descriptive. And like, I know the heading was like something about the vision of what we're fighting for, but like, I think for many of us, like, this work is so hard and it's so long. And like, will I be in the movement when I'm 67, 70? Yes, right? But it's because I've had like people that help shape and inspire me in this way. And so I think the conclusion should be inspiring in that way of like, this is what we can achieve, y'all, if we get better at these little practices.
Lydia, while you're on it, can you also say the piece you were going to raise earlier too?
Yeah, so it is sort of related to the electoral. I feel the electoral didn't necessarily capture kind of like the cutting edge that those of us doing the work are trying to answer, and the path we're on right now, which is like integrated voter engagement isn't about just now doing campaigns that work for the common good versus greedy corporate white supremacists, right? Electoral strategy is really about strengthening the power of our base communities to govern, right? And I think one thing across the nation that I don't see anybody doing well consistently over the years and in a disciplined and rigorous way is being able to take from scale to then scale up the organizing, which is the deep part. Right? Like, that's been my life's work for 3 years, but I'm looking to other people. I talk to other people about this and folks are like, yeah, we need to like do that. Like, we need to get these people back in. And then the actual organizations on the ground are like, well, the voter base doesn't reflect our membership base. So it makes it harder, right? But it's like, well, we're ceding all this power by not building I'm going to use base because I can't find a better word right now, but like, by organizations that are engaging the electoral work nationwide, not bringing those folks or a subset or a certain percentage of those folks back to their local work to actually engage in the day-to-day organizing and leadership development, like, we are missing out big time, right? Like, we could be, a lot of the folks in the electoral work see this base of support that people build to win elections and get people elected. It's like a tactic. So it comes off sometimes as like, yeah, we talked to these 1 million, like 500,000 voters and we won. Well, what are you doing with them? Right? Like, how do those folks translate to power? Not just your volunteers and your current members, if you have them, but like, what are we doing to re-engage these folks beyond just emailing them once a month, right? I'm not trying to degrade other people's work, but it's like, we're just not there yet.
Right.
And being able to have the infrastructure and the skill set at any organization to bring these folks back. And I think that's like the next breakthrough, that if we're able to do that in a way that like these folks see our electoral or whatever integrated voter engagement strategies is like power building and how we come together to build power outside of political parties. Like that's very powerful. And I feel like I'm thirsty for that. I don't get it. Like a lot of the peers are like, yeah, one day we'll get there. And it's like, well, who like, how are we going to get there? Like now is the moment to get there. Like we are losing fucking bad all over the place, y'all. Like, you know, we heard about Oklahoma. They ran all these QAnon people at school district, school boards, and they won. And like, there's literally like 450,000 voters in the whole state. That's like one of my programs in California on a primary election. We talked to like 350,000 people, right? Like, where is that? So like, I feel the electoral part kind of speaks to the bigger, what people see on the outside about integrated voter engagement strategy, which is like winning actual elected seats or winning ballot initiatives. But for us, it's about the long-term transformation, and then how do we harness that power at the local and statewide level to really demand better representatives and demand better of the agenda and demand better of government. So I think like, obviously I could like connect you with folks and all that stuff, but it's like not a lot of people have examples of success around that.
Yeah, and that's actually, we struggle a lot. We wanted to talk about a case like victories, and we're like, oh, it's such a grim picture of left governing power, especially when we were writing this like earlier in the year when everything was like, seemed to be complete failure at the federal level. And then, you know, there's been a little twist, but so yeah, I think those are really important points that we want to lift up, even if we don't have an example of here's where there was major success in the US. We thought of some successes internationally, and we thought of successes for the right wing, but not US left wing.
It's actually a bracing point that that's the case. You know, throw in Harold Washington, Chicago. We've got a few places there, but so maybe.
Oh, and Anna, sorry, Anna had a point on this.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. For some reason, Lydia, the way you just narrated that made me think of another piece that wasn't in the book, I don't think. And I'm like, oh my gosh, somewhere can you do this? Which is to talk about the who, like who's developing strategy and the dynamics of funders versus leaders versus members. Like that's just a whole piece that actually I can imagine some readers feeling, especially leaders of smaller organizations, feeling like I'd love to develop strategy, but I'm totally tethered to, I'm a subcontractor for someone else who's doing the strategy development. So mentioning that vis-a-vis the strategy hubs could be a useful small way of correcting that. Yeah. And then my favorite chapter was the GMHC Act Up chapter. I had not ever connected the dots between the material aid, community support, and then the fierce disruptive capacity. I didn't know that story. I can't believe I didn't know that story. I thought it was so powerful and just, yeah, inspiring.
Thanks. Love to have other folks put favorite chapters in the chat too. So maybe as a last question, maybe not the last question, but I think the last question, like for usability. So, you know, Lorella talked about, or Dorian talked about like the 10-week study, you know, working with it. Danny talked about like the dilemmas of teaching this, or actually maybe if you're not teaching it, like would people be able to use it? You know, Felicia, I wonder about for the organizing adjacent, right? What is useful about this and what would need to be there for it to be more useful? Because we actually need everybody around movement to be conversant with some of this stuff. So just comments about usability. Like what would you change for the people you're thinking about? Specific audiences you're thinking about, community change staff or the Roosevelt staff or Danny, your students or whomever. What would you change? Tools, writing style, you know, yeah.
I actually wouldn't change a lot. because I think you're already trying to successfully, especially if you are explicit about it, address a range of audiences. And so I definitely think that anyone, whether they're in electoral politics, kind of ideas organizing, think tanky types, I think people will take something out of this, and I don't think you actually have to change a lot to be to make this useful, because I actually think so many of my colleagues kind of need just the first principles to from this, meaning there is no single way. It certainly, you shouldn't condemn others for not, if they don't agree with you, there might actually be a strategic reason for it. And then learning some of the historical lessons. So I would not see I think it's quite usable. I think that really the question is, how could different kinds of users take this and make it part of, whether it's a year-long Rockwood style set of relationships, whether it's, I was thinking at Roosevelt, wow, you could take big pieces of this and actually do training for people who are more policy focused, but they could still learn a lot from pieces of this. So I was thinking more like how you would take what is already here and adapt it for whatever context you might trying to be training in. But I don't think you need to change anything more in that way, personally.
Yeah, Lorella, Lydia, Danny, Doreen, anyone? Yeah, go ahead, Lorella.
Sorry if I missed this, but Dee, you were in the thick of many disagreements about strategy, concessions, trade-offs, and I think that's one area where we often get stuck, right? And even in the discussion about sort of non-reformist reforms, like all of that, it doesn't quite get to how to think about the sort of the pragmatic, how do you put pragmatic radicalism into practice in the context of sort of like the thick of the fight. And, I'm thinking about Build Back Better and sort of the immigration campaign, and when you have a coalition that brings different perspectives and theories about power and role, how do you get through it in a way that sets you up for in a way that doesn't reduce your power, which can happen, right? Because we end up getting pitted against each other, and because we're not powerful enough to begin with. And two, how do you get through it? How do we come out of it with sort of maximum wins still possible on the table? And I feel like you have a lot. You try to do that by bringing in the conjunctural, but is there a way to actually bring in some of your experiences sort of in the thick of the fight that really tell a story about how the movement overcame, and then maybe an example where it didn't, right? And what the outcome of that was. There should be a little bit more on the losses maybe throughout the book. So I like how optimistic it was, and also is there a little bit more on what are the lessons learned from the stuff we did not get right?
Yeah, that's really provocative. And I think the compromise stuff is sort of the hardest stuff. It relates to the conflict piece in our movements right now. And I think we could do more on that. I really want to reflect on that point. And the losses point, I think, is very well taken. Yeah, others on usability.
I have one more quick thought on that, Deepak. I'm looking at you, Anna, through the screen. I do wonder on how do those of us who are really thinking about long-term strategy development process, how does this become a tool that can help to grant, so I don't know what you thought about sort of in the post-publishing world, but I do wonder if you guys had some bandwidth, even as consultants to or advisors to some of those projects, like, is there a way to actually bring in the book to help ground some of the conversations, some of the assessments that are necessary? And it doesn't have to be with us, like a lot of different, I think there's a lot of that emerging already in our movement. And so to me, it feels very timely because people are trying to wrestle with or wanting to wrestle with strategy and long-term strategy. And your book is going to come out just as we're all embarking on that after a little bit more space from the governing, like sort of 2 more intense governing years.
Mm-hmm.
The only thoughts I have about use and circulation are things I'm sure you've thought about, like short, I don't know, maybe it's a video or a conversation between the 2 of you that helps kind of get people to think about how it can be taken up and used. And then maybe snapshots of organizers or organizing teachers talking about that as well. So I think just giving it a little bit of context can help guide people through it.
Yeah, I suppose we could even put just the class syllabus up on a website related to the book, or
Yeah.
I'm going to say the next part to Stephanie because Deepak's ego will get too big. The other way, besides a textbook example, what I was thinking about this as, I was kind of thinking of it as like a strategy Bible. And what I mean by that is like, there's a way in which people will keep coming back and back and back and back to it because it is so dense and rich in the best of ways. And so I really much appreciate all the tools and prompts and resources. And I'm actually I'm chomping at the bit to try them out. Lorella knows this, but but there's so much, right? You have like 27 different, and you're probably going to add a few more. So in that sense, it's such a resource because a whole bunch of us will be able to keep coming back to it and using the tools. And actually it's in the practice of using the tools and prompts that we'll be able to give you even more feedback with like, how are they land? And you have this, right? Because you do these in your class. So you already have a sense of how they land for people and how they can take people to different places. The other thing I was thinking that you might want to keep in mind, and this is why the first chapter is going to be so important. People are not going to read this book in a linear way.
Yeah.
So folks will assign particular chapters, or people will go to it for chapter 11, or, so just keep that in. There's nothing you can do about that really, which is why I think of it as really a textbook in a sense. But yeah, it's going to be that kind of a text that people are going to pull and draw from. Chapters are going to be assigned on syllabi or used in organizing trainings. And I keep thinking of it as like the advanced level version of Organizing for Change, the Midwest Academy text that's been, what edition is it on now? 3rd or 4th? Like I envision this as being in the same way. You're going to have 2nd, 3rd, 4th editions of this.
Thanks, Anna.
You just made me think that if you have, I presume you'll have a website around the book. You can imagine asking or encouraging groups to submit their own case studies that they define within different models. That could be super fun. And people want to celebrate. They want to celebrate, the wins, and to have people play with and practice using the language of the model or models that it drew from.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
That's great. Okay, I just want to leave a few minutes open for any last words before we say we're forever in your debt and we're going to go hide under our desk after we heard all the feedback. But first, just any last words? So our timeline is to have a draft, to have the manuscript to the publisher by the end of the calendar year, which we go back and forth about. Is that ambitious? You could see Stephanie's face. I think that's possible, but we shall see. Yeah. So Well, I just want to say, I like this crew is doing such important work, got so much on your plate. For you to invest this kind of time with us on this is like a gift I can't even describe how valuable it is. Like the conversation. I looked at all of your comments over the last couple of days in the piece. I just can't thank you enough. And I asked Stephanie, Olivia, and also to weigh in, but it's just like, it's hugely valuable, like unbelievably so.
Yeah. Yeah, just echoing that. It's I feel like our task was trying to convey all the wisdom that we've been learning from all of you in the movements for all these years. And so it does feel like a very collective project for us. And so we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I can't wait to incorporate all of what you said and then have you all read it and recognize your own,
Totally.
insights and everything, because it really is this, like, we want the book to emulate and model, what we're discussing, which is that we have to pull from all these different things. So from you all, from, history. And also excited to say, the one that I think we mentioned is that didn't really mention. So including to like your favorite chapters, it would be great to know like various things that you think would have been helpful to get illustrations of or images. So we are hiring someone to do illustrations and images throughout the book as well. So for example, power seemed to be like a pretty overwhelming. That's a great example of where it would be probably helpful to have an illustration that, for different types of learners, they could look at it. So if anything comes up and you're like, oh, it would have helped to have a graphic or a little sketch, let us know, because that'll be helpful for us too in terms of explaining things.
You all rock. You're the best. Thank you so much. We all owe you. All of the shit
Thanks
anytime.
for doing it.
Thank you so
Oh,
much.
you. Oh my God.
Thank you.
Contribution.
Really
Thank you
appreciate
all.
you. Thank you so much.
Have a great weekend. Bye.
And you too,
Bye,
Dorian.
everybody.
Thank you too.
And I was just gonna say, I hope you have a very, very joyful set of birthday celebrations, because I know it's a family birthday week for you. So,
Thank you. Take it easy, everybody.
bye, everybody.
Thank you so
All
much.
right, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I didn't know it was Harry's birthday.
Yeah,
Today.
I didn't
Yeah.
either.
Oh, I
He
forgot to
didn't
send
say
you.
anything.
Sorry,
Happy
I forgot.
birthday, Harry.
You could send him a
Yeah.
note if you have his email. I'll
Okay,
put-
I will.
Yeah.
All right, we'll do that.
So just maybe quick 2-minute debrief.
Sure. Yeah. It was helpful, but it felt a little like pulling teeth. Like it felt like a funny.
The
moment of-
beginning was like a riot of energy, and then it sort of subsided. I think people like
Yeah.
shot their shot a little bit, but
Mhm, I
we got
think
good
so.
stuff even out of pulling the teeth.
Yes, we got great stuff and really helpful. I mean, I need to process it, but
Yeah.
I came away though unsure about the formulas. So I think the next two meetings, maybe lifting that question up.
Was it
Yeah.
the formulas or the first formula? The first formula, I think maybe needs to go, but
So I don't feel like we didn't get feedback on
we didn't
that.
get formula on that. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right.
I'm pretty sure, and looking through her comments, that Felicia seemed to be the one that was most against it. I'm pretty sure it was in reference to the first one, where it's like, this is the formula for the book. And I think she is right that it almost feels contradictory for us to put a formula for something that we say there's no formula to. Like the formula is that it changes all the time.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about that. I'm like, it doesn't really make sense for us to try and nail this down into an equation when the purpose of what we're saying is that the equation is ever changing.
Mhm. Mhm.
Overall, I thought it was just really affirming,
Yeah.
I think it was genuine. It wasn't fake enthusiasm. And so
Right.
that's really, really good. I feel like that should
Yeah.
give us confidence and
Yeah. I did have a slight feeling that, sometimes you have in teaching when people didn't do the reading and then they're talking. So I mean, I know some of them really did and read it closely, but it felt like other people maybe hadn't quite, and that's the reality. That's how it goes. So I felt like I was weighing some comments a bit more heavily than others. So, but that's, how it goes.
yeah.
Yeah. So,
right,
yeah,
well-
it was great. Yeah.
I do think one thing that was brought up repeatedly, and maybe that was because, Stephanie, what you said, people were like, oh, I didn't quite read it. Let me piggyback on what this person said because it sounded good. And the comment is a generic one, so it could be that, but that it sometimes loses focus. And I think we all agree on that. And that's why we all thought you know, it would be good for us to go back with an eye of like sharpening and cutting, because I do, maybe part of the reason why people didn't get in is that all the way done is because it can kind of go on these tangents. And so it was interesting that no one really had clear ideas of what to cut, but maybe it's just like sharpening what the existing content. It's not really like cutting anything substantive. It's just
Streamlined.
Okay,
yeah.
it's totally making me anxious, so I think we should stop right now when you start talking about cutting.
Okay.
It's like the way Stephanie goes like this. I'm like, no, I don't want to do that.
Okay, wait, I do have one question, because this was something that for me too, I was like, is this helpful or is it not? Where we give in each model, we say like, here are other examples, right? Like here are other movements. And we were doing it partly just to nod ahead, right? To acknowledge. Is that help? Like, it seemed like some people took issue with that and other people were like, yeah, it was good to have another reference point. And I couldn't really tell which way people swung or even which way I swing when it
Let's see
comes
how
to
it
that.
plays out. Yeah, I think it may be a little case by case. I mean, I think Danny was sort of saying sometimes it's a head nod, and I think he's right. There are a few of those, and I think
Yeah.
maybe case by case, but we should look for that. Yeah, well, I'm actually kind of feeling excited about the next phase of work. Some of the stuff is actually really interesting. The authoritarianism stuff, what do we think, and the bottom lines, and
Yeah, the
so-
digital stuff, like just being a responsible digital citizen, since we all are one now.
Yeah.
I'm not so excited about it mainly because I don't know anything about it, but
We can just say that.
people are like, everybody lives online. I'm like, I have
Yeah.
50,000 tabs open, people, okay? Like, I'm not your model for
Yeah. I was like, have you tried to use a computer at CUNY? No, we're not online.
Totally. Yeah. Okay, I gotta run, but it was great to see you guys, and great
All right.
great first meeting.
Really
Yeah,
great. Really great.
seriously. Okay,
Take it easy.
enjoy your
Have a good
weekend.
Bye.
Bye.